Okay, so quick video. You've heard me say that before, though. I was doing a little bit of Vacated Targets research recently. You know, having a wild and crazy day. I once, upon a time last year, wrote an article looking for the use or potential use of vacated targets, or at least how it was being used to discuss that rookie class that season. And most of the objections I get to the article at this point, outside of mean things, really, why are you only looking at breakouts? It's because that's how they were being used at the time. And honestly, if we're not saying they indicate there's potential for a player to become fantasy relevant who hasn't been fantasy relevant before, then what are we using them for? I think we use them to look for breakouts, but that's mostly what I get in the comments. And not for nothing, but like I like to think I got a good work ethic. I work pretty hard at a hobby that I'm going to pay for, to best understand as well as I can statistics which are outside of my wheelhouse. Fake nerd over here, I get it, but like I work really hard on that one, and it's real clear most of the people that don't like it don't read it, and it's a little upsetting. But you know, good owned. Honestly, that's good. That's a good one. But I was doing some research. I was talking about it on Discord, and I was like, I should write this up. And so I wrote out it's at least a preliminary article, and I posted it on Patreon. And then immediately Patreons were like, "That's a lot of reading." And so here we are. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of what I did and what I found that might be slightly positive for vacated targets, but are not what you think they are, because they're still not what you think they are, because that's not what targets are. Vacated targets, by definition, do not exist. That's not just a fun thing to say on Twitter. By definition, we're saying they no longer exist. But let's get into it. I thought I'd start by just showing you a very boring blank screen of the words I wrote. And look, it's under-fleshed out. I put a few graphs in there and a table and just basically describe what I found. And look how fancy the actual Vacated Targets article is. Although I do think this one's got a better title, because in the actual article on DLF, like I was trying to be all professional and stuff, and so like I put a lot of work into the writing as well, and I tried to sound as neutral as possible. I wasn't trying to take like vacated targets don't exist. I was like, how do they matter? Was literally the title of the article, and I was looking as honestly as I could for I do projections, some way I can use them, and I go and find it. Perhaps my favorite summary in the article is that a team was as likely to lose 100 targets as gain 100 targets, with a significant number of vacated opportunities the year before, and a player was as likely to break out in a team that had lost versus gained 100 targets in that off season as well. And so like it's a null effect when looking at players becoming fantasy relevant all of a sudden. My ultimate conclusion is that yeah, we're still probably better betting on things we know that work on the players themselves, because that's where targets really seem to come from more than, you know, the players that have left or joined the depth chart that off season. And so that's my ultimate conclusion. But again, pushback, and what I basically did in the NFL database, which Patrons know. Okay, this is really boring to visually as well, but I just looked up passing volume year one and then passing volume the next year, and so I created a table to see whether the wide receiver 1 or 2 had left the team, and then if the wide receiver 1 had in fact left the team, so this list, and I found I think 92 instances, 115, okay, a lot more actually. The wide receiver leaves the team, but the wide receiver 2 remains on the team. And then you see what happens to the wide receiver 2 target share, was just my initial instinct. Because I wanted to look for, well, the first thing I wanted to look for was a correlation or some kind of connection between the amount of volume left the team and the amount of passing attempts the following year. Like, was there any kind of connection? And so that's the first graph I've actually got in the article over there. And what I ultimately found was no, not really. It's got like a correlation of 0.1 0.01, which is like a 1% correlation. This is what the graph looks like. There is a slight downturn there. You can see that just barely see. The orange line decreases, so if you lose a lot of vacated targets, there's a slight inclination for you to pass slightly less often the next year. But again, the correlation itself is at 1%, and you can see that that's wildly not the case for most teams. Next, I was looking at target share, because that's the other thing I get challenged with. Well, pass attempt, yeah, but target share, okay, so I looked at the vacated target share of wide receiver ones after they left the team, and if that had any correlation to the target share for the wide receiver one the following season, the answer was no, it had even less correlation. It's like almost a perfectly parallel line here. It's like 0.004%. So no, it doesn't have any direct connection to the passing volume of the team the following year, but we also already know passing volume is relatively consistent, despite the fact that on average teams lose about, depending on the sample size used, they lose about 130 targets, lose as in players leave the team or are not on the team the following season, accrued around, on average, around 130 targets the previous season, and so they are vacated. It's also worth noting that in this uncurated data set, really, I'm counting anyone who didn't record stats the following year as having left. So that could be an injury, preseason injury. Also, I haven't gone through and manicured the data set like I did that first article, because I spent months on that thing, like finding players that had played in two different teams and creating two different lines, so that their targets weren't being counted from one team when they were really playing on another team, because players occasionally change teams mid-season, and so that's some noise in the data, and I haven't done that for this data set. This is just a very broad view, but where I'm just looking at the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2, I felt it was good enough for government work, Government work, it's an English saying. So yeah, I just curated a data set that gave me a pretty good idea of the targets that had left, the target share that had left, and then what the wide receiver 1 and 2 did the following year, and that way I could create graphs to look for correlations. And so that's the first section in that pre-article that I might continue to bulk out as I do more research and maybe turn into an actual full-blown article. It was just that targets lost from players that have left the team the previous year do not have any bearing on the passing attempts overall for the team the next year. And that's where a lot of people get confused. Like, doesn't that mean that they have to be distributed out? Well, they're not distributed out. I think it's better to think of targets as something being created by the players involved. They're not there and then the team issues them, especially with targets. Rushing attempts, maybe, actually. Targets, nah. Teams really have very little control over that. It's about the relationship between the players, the chemistry, and how good they are together on the field. Like, it comes from the player level, much more so than any kind of team level top-down perspective, in my personal opinion, based on, nerdly grinding this stuff for a while. So, what does that ultimately mean? Yeah, they have to they have to go somewhere, but it's really about the players on the depth chart, whether they're going to coalesce into a target share that's significant enough to make them fantasy relevant. You can have as many wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, fullbacks catch targets to distribute out 700 targets, and it never coalesce in a way that creates a fantasy relevant player. Just because the passing attempts are consistent, reasonably through the head coach, reasonably through the team level, consistent year to year, although there are wild swings, and I went through that in that first article in a lot more depth. It doesn't mean there's going to be, therefore, there has to be a 30% target. No, there literally does not have to be. If you don't have DeAndre Hopkins or Keenan Allen, you do not get 30% of those targets coming together as if they exist before those players do anything, in a way that makes them fan. It just doesn't happen if you don't have a good player. Like, that's the best reasoning I can find to understand where targets come from. So just because they still exist or new targets exist the following year does not mean, therefore, we have to distribute them back out where it could make because, again, it has no correlation or connection to breakout. So, in fact, there's relatively little reason to think that this player on this team, having lost DeAndre Hopkins, is therefore going to break out. And I'll point out that Houston example, it's a really weird, like, if you're trying to find the signal for vacated targets, you would probably throw it out. Because you've got 3 players on the depth chart after DeAndre Hopkins leave who all have a previous history of co-opting a large target share with or without DeAndre Hopkins. And so the fact they did it doesn't really seem to suggest it has anything to do with DeAndre Hopkins. I think like Brandon Cooks' average is around 20 to 21% target share on 3 different teams at this point. And in Houston, he got 20 to 21% target. So did that have anything to do with DeAndre Hopkins not being there? Probably not. It would have been lower if DeAndre Hopkins was there. That's the question where I might have found some positive connection or use. But it's not like, and therefore this player I really like who's never done anything will do something. No, in fact, the best answer I have for you if the player's never done anything interesting before, you could throw as many vacated targets as you want on that team. They're probably not going to do much with them. It'll just be distributed out in some other way or to better players that can co-opt a large target share. But I digress a little bit. Positivity. So what I went and ended up looking at was what happens to the wide receiver 2 if they remain on the team. Instead of looking at this team level, let's see if it has any kind of effect on the target share of players that remain on the team. And so since I just had the wide receiver and wide receiver 2 pulled up, I looked for players, wide receiver 2s that remained on the team when the wide receiver 1 was not there the following year for whatever reason. And that's what led me to create this here graph, which is the next section in that article. What I found is around, that's actually terrible. That's not the right correlation there. I thought it was slightly higher than that. Oh, wait, I'm looking at the wrong one. This one. Nerds, right? Wide receiver 2's target share the following year versus their target share the following year. If the wide receiver has left the team, what happens to their target share? And what I found is a pretty decent correlation of around 14%. So there is an effect. To some, 14% is a really weak correlation. It's just twice what, it's like 4 times what the team level was doing for us. I'll point out that target share itself, like if you just look at the wide receiver's target share, it correlates to their target share the following year. I actually did that in this exact data set just so I could see it. Where is it? There it is. 16%. So if you just take, like the player you're interested in that just lost DeAndre Hopkins, whoever that is this year, his target share likely correlates to his target share in 2021 at a 16% clip. That's not great, but it's okay. Volume tends to be okay for NFL statistics as far as NFL statistics go. If you want to adjust by targets lost, with the best signal I found so far is a 14%. So less. You'd be better off, I think, just looking at their target share, projecting regression around a pretty decent regression formula based on their target share and not caring about this. But 14% is close, it's significant, so we'll talk about it. And that's what I wrote. That's the next section in that article. It has this 14% correlation, but what does that really mean? And to understand what a graph, like this is where algebra comes from. I don't know, you probably know that, but like it blew my mind when I realized all those algebra equations I was working on were just mathematical representations of a graph. X and Y, right? If it blew your mind just then, like that, yeah, I'm with you, man. I understood that. So what I ended up doing is, do I still have it up? Yeah. And I pulled up the formula for the slope. And so, where is it? You see this little blue line here? There is a mathematical formula that describes the path this line takes across a graph. And if you ask Excel, it produces it for you right up here. So, what I did is I took that formula and calculated it across different target shares, right? Okay, that probably made no sense. But if the wide receiver 1 that left the team had a 10% target share, unlikely for wide receiver 1, but there you go, then the effect on the wide receiver 2 the following year based on that trend line, and you can actually see that if you consider the graph a little more in depth, you notice that the 0 line is right here on the x-axis, and you notice that a lot of this blue line is negative. It's -0, negative minus negative 10%, and so on. So like technically, and that actually makes some sense when you think about it. If a wide receiver 1 with a low target share leaves the team, then the wide receiver 2 actually gets a lower target share on average, which you might not necessarily have thought of if you value vacated targets, but it makes sense. Like if a player unable to dominate significant targets leaves, then whatever benefit they were providing to the team is probably much more significant than the targets that they were occupying to therefore still be available the following year. And so that hurts the wide receiver 2 more than it helps in terms of their volume as well. Or at least that's how the logic of it works in my head. So yeah, anything below a 22% target share actually has a negative effect. This is a correlation. This is essentially describing that graph line in table form. And so if the wide receiver 1 that leaves the team has a 23% target share or above, there's actually a positive correlation. So the wide receiver 2 gets a slight bump on average at a 14% accuracy. Let's think of it in terms of accuracy, so not very, clip when that wide receiver 1 fails. So if a DeAndre Hopkins leaves the team, and I'll point out, like, almost no wide receiver gets above 35, so you can pretty much just ignore all these guys, but I worked it out all the way just for the kicks and giggles, to be honest. So yeah, DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, looking at a 30% target share more or less. So it could have like a 4% bump to the wide receiver 2, which didn't happen for Cooks based on his average, but he also had Will Fuller. And again, that's probably why you would throw that example out if trying to search for signal on vacated targets. It's because you had other previously established wide receivers there that had done it before and weren't on the team when Hopkins was there, and so it's a pretty loose example. Anyway, and I'll also point out there are very few wide receivers that get that 30% target share. So that 4% bump for the wide receiver 2 at a 14% correlation, so probably ignorable and just use their target share, is unlikely. You're mostly looking at a wide receiver having a target share between, like, again, 21%, so maybe a slight negative effect, to 25, 27, 28. And so really you're looking for like a negative 1% if they had a relatively low wide receiver 1 target share to a 2-3% bump. And so wide receiver 2s that remain on the team that lose a wide receiver 1, and this is without taking into the context of anything else that happens on the depth chart, again, back to the Houston example, could receive around a 3% bump in their target share, looking at no other variables. And that's positive. That means with the wide receiver 1 gone and a significant target share, the wide receiver 2 can be expected to get a slightly higher target share. But again, that's taking in no other variables. It correlates to their target share the following year at a lower rate than just their target share correlates to their target share in the next year. But it does, again, and as I finish that article, there's definite value here, but it's definitely not what we think it is. And so far, like this type of thing, if we dug into it a little more, and I'm thinking about doing it for the stream, the online projection model we're creating, we could make some reasonable expectation of adjustment using it. I mean, when you're just looking for a median example, like a median projection, then some level of this kind of adjustment could work to help create a better expectation if DeAndre Hopkins leaves and you're Will Fuller, right? So yeah, maybe. But Will Fuller wasn't really a wide receiver 2. He was always a wide receiver 1, actually, even when Hopkins was there, when he was healthy. So it's a weird thing about Will Fuller. But anyway, so yeah, I think this is interesting. Again, it shows that there is some level of value here, even though those targets literally don't exist, even though targets are much more created by the players on the team when they're on the team than whoever was on the team the previous year, and it's much more about the players than the coaching staff distributing out targets, because they really don't get that decision. And like maybe rushing attempts would work better this way. But yeah, there's positive stuff here, and that's as far as I've gone so far. That's what that little mini article says, and at least the broad strokes of it. Again, it's a fairly basic article. Mini preliminary article as I'm digging into just looking at basic correlations. What do these relationships say? So yeah, and again, I can make other graphs with this to look for other relationships in the data, but this is as far as I've got, and that's what that article says. So I hope this helps Connor, because you didn't have to read it, because yeah, that's basically what I've said so far. Like on a team level, actually, I thought my conclusion was pretty lit, because I thought it came together to form a fairly interesting summary of what I can say about Vacated Targets so far when I combine the two research projects, this mini one and the one I actually did for a full-blown article on DLF. Let's see, what did I say? I think we know that vacated opportunity doesn't help to identify likely breakouts based on my first article, or at least breakouts break down to about a 50-50% on teams that lose a large scale of their volume, so again, kind of not helpful. But now based on this, at least somewhat extra research, it doesn't help to predict team passing attempts, and so team passing attempts can be seen to be relatively stable no matter how much volume is lost, which actually does speak to the potential of vacated targets, but the distribution of it to a fantasy relevant degree, the level of vacated opportunity doesn't suggest that you're more or less likely to find that fantasy relevant distribution. That's back to the breakout thing. But if a player vacates at least 23% of the target share, then the target share increase for the wide receiver 2, if they remain on the team, potentially might be slightly higher, even though it has a weaker correlation than the wide receiver 2's target share in and of itself. It makes sense because it's likely saying that unless the wide receiver 2 was already heavily involved, they're not likely to see a boost at all. But if they are, they could see a 1-3% boost, or even potentially a negative effect of that wide receiver 1 leaving the team. All that, if fairly rough and I should really put grammar in here. All that, if fairly rough and ready, and not a manicured data set. Look at me editing live. It's just our NFL database, and I worked it a little, so this is me just saying I didn't manicure the data as well as I've already done in this video. But I think that's where I'm at. I'm not stretching my conclusions here. I'm saying definitely there's relevant information, but it's not to identify who's likely to get their first high distribution, or a more likely breakout situation, or something that greases the wheel that good players can step in. Like, it's not like Brandon Cooks or Will Fuller stepped on without DeAndre Hopkins was like, finally, I can get to that 30% share. No, they did kind of what they do, and both have a decent enough sample size. We know they're wide receiver ones when given the opportunity. If they're on a high-scoring team, it could be really fantasy effective, but they're not going to do that in and of it by themselves, because they get around 20 to 23% target share. They're amazing, but they're not Hopkins, they're not Michael Thomas, who can co-opt it no matter what the team is doing, and therefore have fantasy relevance in that floor through volume, and therefore you're just looking for team efficiency to boost you into that top 12. Stephon Diggs has shown a higher level capacity for earning targets than both of those players, for example. Will Fuller is actually a little closer, but not that far. So, yeah, I don't think it's telling us about the things we wish it told us about. And I think that's as fair as I can say it right now. Not that we couldn't find that. I do know, and since, getting shouted at online about it again, like I found out Kevin, what do you know him as? Kevin Wayranch from PFF. He actually wrote an article. He told me about it at the time. It turns out, because it's behind a PFF paywall, I was just never able to read it. But I have finally asked him not to give me the PFF goodness for free, but just give me the broad strokes of what his research goals were so that I can look myself. Because he basically, I think, and I went on about that. He hasn't told me yet, but I went on off my own while he found time to reply to me because he's with his family. It was Mother's Day. Found that target share correlation for the wide receiver 2 if the wide receiver 1 left with a significant... I think it's in that ballpark that he found. And so, again, positive information, but it's not like, therefore, the wide receiver 2 gets a 25%. No, they're getting a 1-3% boost. And so if they were at 12%, that's not going to do it. If they're at 18, it might be slightly more interesting. But again, that's taking in no other variables, and you'd probably be better off for projections. Right now, I think just using a regression formula on their previous year target share, because that has a stronger correlation to their target share in year N+1 by itself without having to go through vacated targets. But again, I think I've said all this. Like, I don't know. I can definitely see how it's useful. I understand why it's so thrilling. But, my big conclusion is, by the way, everything that no one says, but we perceive, I think when you write about vacated targets and you track it and you talk about the opportunity on the team, the way I internalize that as breakouts, or players are going to get these fantasy relevant ceilings because Hopkins or whoever is gone. And ultimately, that's not how it seems to work, at least, or I can't find it working that way. Although there is some suggestion that there will be a slight boost, but I said it 3 times now. I don't know how excited I would be, because already you need a wide receiver 1 getting a wide receiver 1 target, like a full-blown wide receiver 1 target share, for it to even give you an increase. And then it's between 1% and 3%. It's not like they therefore get 23% of the targets. It's just a little more complicated than that, as life tends to be, and that sucks, I guess. But it's definitely interesting stuff. If you're a fake nerd like me, I guess. Anyway, big screen. Mostly because I needed a drink, so I'm getting dry here. Anyway, patrons who didn't want to do the reading, I get it. I try it. Who wants to read, apart from maybe me? But yeah, that's essentially what I've found so far. It's not an all-round conclusion. It's not I've never dismantled Vacated, despite how I like to meme on Twitter. I would honestly like to find a way of using the value of all information, which includes vacated opportunity, but it is kind of fun to point out it's not what most people try to use it as. Not John Daigle. He understands this stuff better than I do, and not Kevin, because he's on PFF and has already done more advanced research on this, and I'm hoping to find out more about. Not Tanho, who, keeps threatening to look, but never actually quite looks. Weird. But yeah, that's where I'm at. It's not how a lowly idiot fantasy drone like myself understands that information. It's not therefore higher ceiling, therefore larger target, like not to necessarily a significant degree. It's not what I thought it was when I first came across the idea and was like, wow, that's interesting. And so I assume that's happening for most of us. And maybe I'm wrong. Let me know if you already were like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's about what I expected. Then you're maybe a real nerd, I guess. And congrats. But yeah, sorry. Those are my thoughts. That's a slightly new research. I did all of this and more in depth, but it was a year ago now, and I lost all those sheets because I have way too many. Yeah, so anyway, so there you go. That's me basically summarizing the mini article I wrote for Patreons. Bye?